A young man holds a sword low in one hand. In the other, raised toward the viewer, he holds a severed head by its hair. Blood still runs from the neck, dark against the pale wrist that grips it. The head is not calm. The mouth hangs open. The brow is knotted. The eyes have not fully closed, caught somewhere between the moment of the blow and the stillness that follows it. Around both figures there is almost nothing. No landscape, no crowd, no city or countryside to place the scene in. Only a darkness so complete that the two faces and the blade seem to have been carved out of black stone by a single beam of light, falling from somewhere above and to the left. And the boy holding the head does not look triumphant. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He looks almost sorry, as if the weight in his outstretched hand is heavier than a trophy has any right to be. This is David with the Head of Goliath, painted in Naples, or possibly finished in Rome, sometime around 1609 or 1610, in the final months of the life of the man who painted it. What the museum label in front of it does not always say plainly is that the severed head belongs to the artist himself. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio painted his own face onto the giant a boy had just struck down, and within a matter of months of finishing this canvas, he was dead, in circumstances that have never been fully settled. The question the painting leaves behind has very little to do with the biblical story of David and Goliath. It has to do with why a hunted man would spend some of his last working hours painting a picture of his own execution, and whether, in doing so, he already understood how his own story was going to end. Caravaggio was born in Milan in 1571 and trained there under a minor painter before making his way to Rome in his early 20s, arriving with little money and, by most accounts, an even shorter temper. Rome in the 1590s was crowded with painters competing for the attention of cardinals and wealthy private collectors, and Caravaggio's early years there were lean, painting for dealers at low prices, reportedly including a period spent producing quick still life and genre pictures for a workshop that resold them, before Cardinal Francesco del Monte took him into his household and began sending real commissions his way. Del Monte's residence, the Palazzo Madama, gave Caravaggio a place to live, a circle of educated patrons to paint for, and the kind of protection that let a volatile young painter with a reputation for trouble keep working instead of being thrown out of the city at the first complaint. It was under Del Monte's patronage that Caravaggio developed the technique that would make him one of the most influential painters in Europe, a style built on violent contrasts between darkness and a single hard source of light, later given the name tenebrism, in which faces and hands seem to be dragged bodily out of the black behind them. It is the same technique visible in David with the Head of Goliath, and the same technique that made Caravaggio's religious paintings feel less like devotional images and more like scenes a viewer had stumbled into by accident, lit by a lamp someone else was holding. That technique did not always sit comfortably with the people who commissioned it. His Calling of St. Matthew, painted for a chapel in the church of San Luigi dei Francesi, made saints out of tax collectors seated at what looks like an ordinary tavern table, and it drew crowds precisely because it looked so little like the polished religious painting Rome was used to. His Death of the Virgin, commissioned for a chapel in Santa Maria della Scala, was rejected outright by the friars who had paid for it, reportedly because Caravaggio had used the drowned corpse of a young woman pulled from the Tiber as his model for the Virgin's body, a detail that later biographers repeated, even if it cannot be confirmed beyond dispute, and because the swollen, discolored feet and unglamorous stillness of the figure struck the friars as closer to a morgue than a miracle. The painting was pulled from the altar within days of its unveiling. Rubens, then working in Rome, admired it enough to help arrange its sale to the Duke of Mantua rather than let it disappear. Even at the height of his success, in other words, Caravaggio was already a painter whose work unsettled the very institutions paying for it, and whose reputation for trouble extended from the tavern to the altar and back again, a pattern that would only deepen once the trouble stopped being about a rejected altarpiece and started being about a dead man in the street. Success in Rome did not calm him. The surviving court and police records of the period, the kind that historians have spent decades combing through, describe a man who carried a sword through the streets without the license required to do so, who was arrested for throwing a plate of artichokes at a waiter's face over a disagreement about how they had been cooked, who assaulted a fellow painter, and who was repeatedly hauled before magistrates for offenses ranging from public insults to actual violence, always managing, through the intervention of powerful patrons to avoid serious punishment. This pattern held until May of 1606. During a ball game that turned violent near the Campo Marzio, Caravaggio killed a man named Ranuccio Tomassoni. Accounts from the period disagree on the exact cause. Some describe a dispute over a wager on the match, others a quarrel connected to a woman both men knew, and the fatal wound may have been delivered as Caravaggio aimed for Tomassoni's leg and struck an artery instead. Whatever the precise sequence, the outcome was not in dispute. A man was dead, and this time none of Caravaggio's patrons could make the matter disappear. Rome responded by issuing what was called a bando capitale against him, a formal capital sentence that did more than simply mark him for arrest. Under its terms, any person within the Papal States was legally permitted to kill Caravaggio on sight and present his severed head to the authorities as proof, without fear of prosecution for the act. The artist who would later paint his own decapitated head onto a canvas was, in the eyes of the law he was fleeing, already a man whose actual head carried a price. He left Rome within days and never returned to it alive. He spent time first in Naples, protected by the Colonna family, whose ties to his own family stretched back generations, and who gave him work and cover while Rome's anger cooled. From Naples he sailed to Malta, seeking the protection and prestige of the Order of St. John, a military and religious order that answered to the Pope but governed the island in practice as an independent state with its own laws and its own prisons. Caravaggio painted for the order at extraordinary speed and scale, producing among other works the enormous beheading of St. John the Baptist for the order's own cathedral, a painting so large it remains the biggest he ever completed and the only one he ever signed his name to, writing it in red paint made to look like blood, running from the wound in the Baptist's throat. In return, the order made him a knight, an honor that came bundled with the hope, quietly understood on all sides, that it might eventually help clear his name in Rome. The ceremony required a formal dispensation from the Pope himself, since Caravaggio's outstanding sentence for the killing of Tomassoni technically made him ineligible for membership in an order built around notions of honor and discipline, and the fact that Rome granted the dispensation at all suggests how seriously his patrons were working, behind the scenes, to engineer a path back for him. For a brief stretch of time, robed as a knight of justice and given rooms befitting his new rank, it must have seemed to Caravaggio, for the first time in years, that the worst of his exile was finally behind him and that some kind of ordinary future was possible again. That hope lasted less than a year. In August of 1608, Caravaggio was involved in a violent altercation with a senior knight of the order, the exact details of which have not survived in full, and he was thrown into a fortress prison on the island, a cell cut into solid rock and considered escape-proof. He escaped anyway, by means that historians still cannot fully reconstruct, an achievement that alone tells you something about either his desperation or his connections, and the order responded by formally stripping him of the knighthood and expelling him from its ranks in absentia. He was, once again, a wanted man, and now doubly so, hunted by Rome for the killing of Tomassoni, and hunted by an order with both the motive and the long reach to see him found. He surfaces next in Sicily, moving quickly between Syracuse, Messina, and Palermo, producing altarpieces for churches and confraternities at a pace that suggests either enormous energy or the awareness that he could not safely stay anywhere long. Works including the burial of St. Lucy and the raising of Lazarus, paintings that his earliest biographers, writing within a generation of his death, described as increasingly stark, populated by fewer figures set against ever larger fields of darkness. Those early biographers, among them Giovanni Baglione, a rival painter who had once sued Caravaggio for libel, and later Giovanni Pietro Bellori, both describe a man in this period who slept with a dagger close at hand, and who was, in Bellori's account, convinced that men were still hunting him. Whether or not every detail in these accounts can be trusted, given that both writers had their own reasons to shape Caravaggio's reputation after his death, the broad picture of a man unraveling under pressure is consistent across every source that survives. A later Sicilian biographer, Francesco Susino, writing decades after the events he described, added an image that has stayed with historians even where they cannot fully verify it, of Caravaggio sleeping fully dressed with his sword beside him, unwilling to remove his boots even at night, in case he needed to run before he had time to put them back on. Susino also claimed that Caravaggio, working on the raising of Lazarus in Messina, grew so agitated with an assistant that he drew a blade on him in the middle of the commission. A man who behaved this way was not simply difficult. He was, by every surviving account, someone who no longer believed himself safe anywhere, at any hour, even in a city where he had just been paid to paint a miracle. By late 1609, he was back in Naples, and it was there, outside the Osteria del Cirilio, a tavern he was known to frequent, that he was ambushed by several armed men. A contemporary Roman newsletter, the kind of handwritten aviso that circulated news and gossip among the well-connected, first reported that the great painter Caravaggio had been killed in the attack, then issued a correction days later. He had survived, though gravely wounded, his face reportedly cut badly enough that some who saw him afterward said he was hard to recognize. Historians have generally connected this attack to the lingering enmity of the Knights of Malta, an organization not known for forgiving an insult, and one with the resources to arrange for a blade to find a former knight even in a different kingdom entirely. The same newsletter that reported his survival noted that his face had been so altered by the wounds that people who had known him were said to have struggled to recognize him afterward, a detail that, if accurate, means the man who sat down not long after to paint his own face onto Goliath's severed head was painting a face that had itself recently been cut open and permanently changed. It was in the months following this attack, disfigured, still hunted, and still without the pardon from Rome he needed before he could ever safely go home, that Caravaggio painted David with the head of Goliath. The painting rewards the kind of close looking that a single glance never offers. David is young, his shirt open at the chest, his expression carrying none of the swagger a viewer expects from the shepherd boy who felled a giant. Instead, there is something close to reluctance in his face, even pity, as he holds the head out at arm's length, angled away from his own body, as though he would rather not be the one carrying it at all. Goliath's face, by contrast, bears every mark of age and violence that David's does not: a furrowed brow, an open mouth frozen between the blow and death, a beard streaked with grey, a neck still torn open at the base. Set that face beside Caravaggio's earlier self-portraits, the youthful Bacchus he painted of himself in his 20s, flushed and offering a glass of wine to the viewer, the sideways glancing musician among the figures in his early musicians, or the terrified severed head he had already given himself once before. Years earlier, in Judith beheading Holofernes, painted while he was still an established and celebrated figure in Rome, long before any of the trouble that would define his later life, and the resemblance in the Goliath is not a matter of guesswork or wishful pattern matching. That earlier painting already shows Caravaggio placing his own face on a man losing his head at a woman's hand, which makes David with the head of Goliath not an isolated impulse near the end of his life, but the second time he returned to the same private image, years apart, under very different circumstances, as though the picture of his own decapitation was one he kept coming back to long before it had any obvious reason to feel urgent. Art historians studying the painting alongside these earlier self-images have treated the identification as close to settled for a very long time. Caravaggio put his own likeness, aged now by years of flight, violence, and one recent attempt to kill him, onto the head of the giant a much younger version of himself has just cut down. The choice is stranger still when set against how other artists of the period had handled the same subject. Michelangelo's marble David and Donatello's bronze both show the boy before the killing, poised, confident, sometimes almost vain about the body that will do the deed. Caravaggio instead paints the single worst moment available to him, the instant just after, when the head is still recognizably a face and not yet simply an object, and he places that face at nearly the same scale and the same eye level as David's own, so that the two heads seem to hang in the same small pool of light, like two sides of a single portrait, rather than a hero and his trophy. Nothing in the composition asks the viewer to celebrate. The sword is lowered, not raised. The arm holding the head does not extend it toward the light for display so much as push it slightly away from the body, the gesture of someone who has finished a task he did not enjoy. Look closely enough at the sword blade in David's hand, and in the right light, a viewer standing in front of the painting in Rome today can still make out 5 etched letters, H, AS, and OS. Scholars examining the inscription have connected it to a phrase attributed to St. Augustine: humility kills pride. The letters are faint enough that they were not widely discussed until conservators and scholars examined the surface closely during later cleaning and study of the canvas. at which point the abbreviation became difficult to read as anything other than deliberate. No surviving letter in Caravaggio's own hand explains what he meant by placing those words on the very blade that had just done the killing in the scene, since no such letter from him about this painting has ever been found. But the timing makes the reading difficult to set aside. The most widely accepted account of the painting's origin holds that it was intended, whether through a direct request or through intermediaries working on Caravaggio's behalf, for Cardinal Scipione Borghese, nephew of Pope Paul V and one of the most powerful private art collectors in Rome, a man whose word carried real weight with a pardon still pending in the papal court. If that account is correct, the painting was never simply a devotional commission. It was closer to a piece of evidence, submitted in Caravaggio's own defense, in the only language left to him that anyone with power might actually look at, a picture that seemed to say the proud, violent man Caravaggio had once been was already dead, judged, and executed on the canvas itself, and that what the cardinal now held in his collection was proof the debt had already been paid. Not every scholar accepts this reading in full. Some caution that no surviving document explicitly states the painting was sent as a plea for pardon, and that the connection, however persuasive, is built from circumstantial timing rather than a signed instruction from Caravaggio or a receipt from the cardinal's household. What is not in dispute is the timing itself, that the painting was produced in the exact window when Caravaggio's freedom depended entirely on Roman goodwill, and that Cardinal Borghese was among the very small number of people positioned to supply it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What makes the painting difficult to look away from, once this context is in view, is precisely the expression Caravaggio gave to David. A triumphant killer does not usually look at what he has just done the way this boy does. His brow stays drawn, his mouth sits somewhere between distaste and grief, and his arm, though fully extended, does not present the head so much as hold it at a distance, as if he would rather not be seen holding it at all. If the head is Caravaggio's own face, David becomes something more complicated than the young hero of Scripture. He becomes an earlier version of the same man, the artist as he might once have been, before the years of violence and flight, looking with something close to sorrow at what he had since turned into. The painting does not simply depict a killing carried out. It stages a single man judging himself twice over, cast at once as the executioner and as the executed, standing in the same small circle of light with nowhere else for the eye to go. The plea, if that is what the painting was, arrived close to the end of a very long wait. By the summer of 1610, word had reached Caravaggio, through channels historians still debate the precise nature of, that a pardon from Rome might finally be within reach after 4 years of exile. He gathered several paintings, likely including works meant as part of the settlement with Cardinal Borghese, and boarded a small felucca sailing north from Naples along the coast toward Rome. What happened over the following days has been reconstructed from scattered and sometimes contradictory sources, but the broad shape of it is agreed upon by most historians who have studied his final weeks closely. The boat put in at Palo, a small fortified port along the coastal road, where Caravaggio was detained, apparently mistaken for someone else or caught up in a dispute over his papers, and held for 2 full days. When he was finally released, the boat carrying his belongings and his paintings had already sailed on without him. He had to continue north along the coast on foot or by whatever transport he could find, in the punishing heat of a Mediterranean July, already unwell, and without the resources that had been on that boat. The coastline between Palo and Porto Ercole runs through marshland that in the 17th century was known for the fevers that rose from its stagnant water in summer, and whatever illness or injury Caravaggio was already carrying by the time he set out on foot, that stretch of country was not the place to walk through it. He had, by this point, spent 4 years moving between kingdoms with a bounty on his name, survived a fortress prison, been cut open outside a tavern in Naples, and lost the boat carrying nearly everything he owned, including, by most reconstructions, David with the Head of Goliath itself, which appears to have continued on toward Rome without him. He reached Porto Ercole, a fortified town then under Spanish control, walking the last stretch of that road alone, without the paintings, without the letters that might have confirmed his pardon, and without anyone left from his own household to help him, and there, within days, he died. The parish burial record lists a fever as the cause, and for centuries that was nearly the whole of the documented story. An artist of enormous and disruptive talent, already dead at 38, brought down by an illness picked up somewhere on a desperate road home. More recent research has added real detail without fully settling the matter. In 2010, on the 400th anniversary of his death, a team of Italian researchers, working under the direction of Silvano Vincetti, a figure known for leading several such investigations into the remains of historical artists, examined bone fragments believed, though not proven beyond all dispute, to be Caravaggio's own, recovered from a crypt in Porto Ercole. Their analysis found levels of lead in the bone consistent with chronic lead poisoning, a hazard well documented among painters of the period who ground and handled lead-white pigment for years with no understanding of what it was doing to their bodies. Lead poisoning can produce exactly the kind of instability, joint pain, and eventual physical collapse that contemporary accounts associate with Caravaggio's final years on the run, and some researchers have proposed that this, layered on top of the injuries from the Naples ambush and the exhaustion of the final journey, is what a clerk in Porto Ercole simply recorded as fever, the vocabulary available to him at the time. Other historians have never fully abandoned the possibility that the men who had wanted him dead in Naples finished the job on the road north, and that his death, whatever the parish register says, was not an accident of the body at all. The British art historian Andrew Graham Dixon, whose biography of Caravaggio remains one of the most detailed accounts of these final months, has argued for a version of this theory, proposing that the Knights of Malta, or agents acting on their behalf, tracked Caravaggio to the coast and ensured he never reached Rome to receive the pardon that would have restored his standing and, with it, some measure of protection. Malaria has also been raised as a plainer explanation, given how common the disease was along that exact stretch of coast in summer, and it remains entirely possible that no single dramatic cause is needed at all, that a body already weakened by lead exposure, untreated wounds, and exhaustion simply gave out under conditions that killed healthier men every year. No consensus has settled the matter, and it is unlikely that one ever fully will, given how little direct physical evidence survives from a burial that took place in haste, for a fugitive, in a small coastal town with no reason at the time to think his grave would still be discussed 4 centuries later. What can be said with more confidence than either theory is the timing. Several accounts hold that the formal pardon from Rome, the outcome Caravaggio had spent 4 years chasing across 3 kingdoms and a fortress prison, arrived at almost the same moment he was dying, or very shortly after, meaning he may have died within reach of the very thing the painting in Cardinal Borghese's collection had likely been sent to secure. Seen against that timeline, David with the Head of Goliath stops looking like a straightforward religious commission and starts looking like something closer to a document written in the last language its author still had available to him. He painted his own death, presented it as evidence of a debt already settled, and then, not so very long afterward, paid with the rest of his life anyway. Whether that amounts to prediction in any mystical sense is not a claim this account is prepared to make on his behalf. What the surviving record does support is something almost as unsettling in its own right, that a man on the run, disfigured, unwell, and running out of time, studied his own face closely enough to place it onto a corpse, and that the corpse he chose to paint was his own, months before it had actually happened to him. The painting survives today in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, held in the same collection built by the cardinal it may once have been sent to persuade, and it remains one of the most visited single works in a museum full of major paintings. Conservators and curators there have continued to study its surface and its condition over the years, including the faint inscription on the sword, as part of the broader effort to understand exactly what Caravaggio intended, and precisely when, in that final, hunted year, the picture was finished. It hangs today not far from other Caravaggio canvases the Borghese collection holds, among them The Boy with a Basket of Fruit and the Madonna dei Palafrenieri, paintings from earlier, steadier years that show the same eye for unglamorous, physical human detail, without the particular weight that David with the Head of Goliath carries once a viewer knows what came after it. Standing in that room, moving from the fruit basket to the Madonna to the severed head, a visitor can trace something like the arc of the man's whole career in 3 canvases, from a young painter noticing the bruise on a piece of fruit, to a hunted one painting the face he expected the world to eventually take from him. Visitors who arrive knowing nothing of Ranuccio Tomassoni, or the fortress cell in Malta, or the tavern ambush in Naples, or the felucca that sailed on without him, still tend to stop in front of this particular canvas longer than its modest size alone would explain. Something in the boy's face holds them there, even before a guide or a wall label offers any reason why. Once the story is known, the paint itself does not change. The brushwork stays exactly as Caravaggio left it, but the picture carries a different weight afterward. The boy holding the head is no longer simply a boy. He is Caravaggio near 20, looking without quite wanting to, at Caravaggio near 40, already gone, already judged by his own hand, and already, in a way no parish register in Porto Ercole could ever have thought to record, foretold. No painter sets out expecting a single canvas to outlive every explanation attached to it, and Caravaggio, hunted and out of options in Naples, was almost certainly thinking only as far ahead as the pardon he needed and the powerful man he needed to convince. That the picture would still be read, 400 years later, as something closer to a confession written in a dead man's own hand is not a claim he could have planned for. It is simply what the painting became, once the ordinary run of events after it was finished happened to include his own death, on a road he had not meant to be walking, in a summer he did not survive. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over the room in the Galleria Borghese where this canvas hangs, different from the quiet in front of the museum's marble sculptures or its brighter, earlier paintings. Visitors tend to lower their voices without being asked to. Some stand close enough to study the sword, looking for the letters they have read about, and some step back to take in the whole composition at once, the two faces suspended in the same narrow shaft of light against all that surrounding dark. Either way, they tend to leave the room having looked longer than they expected to. A picture that began, in all likelihood, as a private and desperate appeal to a single powerful man in Rome has ended up as something closer to a public confession, still legible 4 centuries later, to anyone willing to stand still in front of it long enough to read what the boy's face and the giant's face are both quietly saying about the same one man. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.